Does the fact that something exists prove that God exists? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Today, we'll talk about an argument for the existence of God given by Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican friar. He is arguably the most important Christian philosopher in history. Now, he actually has 5 famous arguments for the existence of God that are found in his most famous work, the Summa Theologica. And I have videos on all of those 5, so you can watch those. But today we're going to do a different argument, an argument that doesn't show up in that work. This one comes from his work, De Ente et Essentia, on being in essence, which is an earlier work of his. And personally, I would say this is my favorite argument for the existence of God, not because I think it's the most convincing to most people. In fact, it's not easy to understand. You need to know a little bit of Aristotelian philosophy ahead of time, and we'll go through some of that stuff. But I like it because I think it's a solid argument, and it proves more than just the existence of God. It goes through some of his attributes. So before we actually get into the argument, we're going to have to do a little groundwork, a little philosophy, little pre-party. Aquinas distinguishes between two things, esse and essence. Essence is the whatness of a thing. So if I look at today, my wife and I went to Hidden House Coffee. Today, if I look at my coffee cup, there is a whatness to this thing, right? What is it? It's a kind of a thing, right? But there's also a thatness to it, that it exists. And that is what Aquinas will call its esse. Now, that is esse, that's in Latin. A lot of people translate this into existence. I would do so, except for there is a lot of philosophy that comes after Aquinas that changes that word existence. It takes on a lot of different baggage that we don't really want to get into. So I'm going to keep using the word esse, but if you get confused, just remember it's just a word meaning existence, meaning that the thing exists rather than what the thing is. And it's important you know that the esse of a thing is an act, not a property. It's not like, this thing is brown, this thing is round, and et cetera, plus it exists. Existence is not an extra thing you throw on top of all the properties of the thing. Existence is what this thing is doing. It is existing, right? That's a verb. And for Aquinas, there is a real distinction to be had here. There's a distinction between essence and esse that is not just in the mind. This would be something akin to like a heart and its beating. The heart and the beating are not the same thing, right? They are two distinct things because the heart could exist without beating. Of course, beating couldn't exist without the heart. The beating is what the heart is doing, right? It's an action of the heart, but it's not the heart itself. So there is a real distinction there. So the first thing Aquinas needs to do is to prove that esse and essence are actually distinct, are really distinct, not just conceptually distinct. But he starts off by pointing out the fact that they are conceptually distinct. They are two distinct things in the mind. And how does he show that? By the following argument. First, no essence is understood without understanding its parts. You can't know what a thing is if you don't know the stuff that makes it up. Now, anything that is not part of the essence of the thing, but is part of the individual, must come to it from without and enter into composition with the essence. If it doesn't come from the essence itself, right, it has to come from somewhere. So anything that doesn't enter into the understanding of the essence comes to it from without and enters into composition with the essence. But the essence can be understood without the esse. And Aquinas gives as an example here, you can know what a man is or what a phoenix is without knowing whether or not those things exist. In other words, without knowing its esse. Now, before we go any further, you should know that there is an objection from Aristotelians who are not Thomists. So Thomas Aquinas himself is an Aristotelian, but he goes beyond Aristotle. And Aristotelians have this objection. If you don't know what I'm talking about, not a big deal. You can skip this part. But if you're an Aristotelian and you've thought this would be a good objection for him to answer for you. So Aristotelians might say, well, look, things don't need an esse in order to exist. They exist through their form, right? Aquinas says the form, which is the structuring principle of the matter, does not actually entail the existence of the thing. Otherwise, every form would exist. There wouldn't just be possible forms. Everything would exist. And so, every essence is conceptually distinct from its esse, unless there's a thing whose essence could be its actual esse itself. What is that? A thing whose essence is its esse, is its existence. A thing whose whatness is the fact that it exists, is that action of existence. Well, Aquinas says that would be subsistent esse. It would be pure esse. It wouldn't exist in virtue of some outside principle or anything like that. It would just exist in virtue of what it is. It just is existence. And Aquinas goes further in pointing out that if there were such a thing, then there could be only one of them. And he shows that this is the case by pointing out that there are only three ways that we can have a multiplicity of things, multiplicity of the same kind of a thing. First, you can have a multiplicity where you have the adding of a difference. So this would be like when you have a genus that is multiplied into different species. And this is very Aristotelian, by the way. The idea is not like the kingdom, phylum, genus, right? All those things. It's kind of like that. But the idea here is if you have a genus like animal, you can multiply the kinds of animal there are by adding differences. So one animal is a rational animal. That's human, right? So you add the difference of rationality into that genus of animal and you get a species, human. So that's the first way that you can have a multiplicity. The second way would be a form that is received into diverse matter. And this would be how a species gets broken up into different actual individuals. You have the form of human, and yet this human is different from this human over here. Why? Because they have different matter. Same form, but different matter. And then the third way he points out is insofar as something is one and absolute and received in something else. And what does that mean? That you have to look at Plato's forms. That's what he's talking about. He doesn't actually believe in Plato's forms, but he's just giving you some different options of how there could be a multiplicity. So you can go actually check my video on Plato's forms if you're not sure what I'm talking about. But the idea here is like you would have something like humanness, and this person is a human and this person is a human because they both participate in the form of humanness. Again, Aquinas doesn't actually believe that that's what happens, but he's giving you the possibilities here. Okay, now this self-subsistent esse that we're talking about, a thing whose essence is its esse. He says it can't be a multiplicity by receiving a difference, because then it wouldn't be just pure esse, it would be esse plus form. You would have this additional form that's added on to it. Then it couldn't be a multiplicity as a form being received into different matter, because then it would be material esse and not subsistent esse. And he actually gives two arguments for this. The first one is from generation and corruption. And it goes like this. If a thing is made of different principles, then it is subject to generation and corruption. Generation meaning you can make it, corruption meaning you could destroy it. And if a thing is made of different principles, then you can separate those principles and destroy it. But subsistent esse wouldn't be something that could be destroyed. It's pure existence. That's just what it is. So it couldn't not exist. That's what it is. But things that are made of matter have material as their principle, as one of their principles, right? And form would be the other one of their principles. So you would have two principles and those things could be separated. So self-subsistent esse can't be like that. It can't be material. And the other reason he gives is that if it were material, then it would depend on the material for its existence. And yet it's self-subsistent esse, right? It doesn't depend on anything for its existence. It just is esse. It just is existence. So it couldn't be a material thing. An interesting corollary here, and again, this argument and we're not even to the argument yet, but this argument, I like it a lot because there's a lot of interesting things that you learn. And one of them is this self-subsistent esse is got to be non-material, can't be a material thing. Then finally, he says this thing cannot be multiplied in the way that we're talking about, like Plato's forms. And that's because that is not a multiplication of being. It's a participation in that being of other beings. And as an analogy here, he gives the sun heats many things, but that doesn't mean that there are many suns. I mean, we know that there are many stars, but pretend there was only one star. Just because it heats a lot of different things doesn't mean we have a lot of different stars. And so we see that none of those three ways of being a multiplicity apply to the self-subsistent esse. So the self-subsistent esse can be only one. So here's another interesting corollary. This self-subsistent esse, not only can it not be material, but it can't be more than one. And of course, this self-subsistent esse, what we're leaning towards, what we're going to eventually call it, is God. That shows that there can't be more than one God. In any case, back to the argument about the distinction here. Aquinas then says, aside from this self-subsistent esse, this thing whose essence is its esse, everything else must have their essence and their esse actually distinct. Now, some people argue, but this is going from a conceptual distinction to a real distinction. You started off by saying these two things are different in my mind, and now you're saying they're different in reality. You can't do that. But John Whipple actually argues that this is more of a modal argument that Aquinas is giving, and it looks like this. Possibility is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for actuality. So what is intrinsically impossible cannot be actual. And then what is not actual is nothing. So what is intrinsically impossible is nothing. And what we've shown here in this argument is that it's impossible for there to be more than one pure esse, more than one essence that is its esse. So therefore, in reality, there is not more than one. Okay, now that we've laid the groundwork, let's get into the actual argument itself. The argument goes like this. In the things of our experience, the things like our coffee cup here, their features are either from some intrinsic principle or for something on the outside, some extrinsic principle. They either come from inside of the thing, what the thing is, or they come from outside of the thing. So, for example, when we talk about humans, risability would be an example of something that comes from your intrinsic nature. Risability is the fact that you laugh, the fact that you can laugh. That comes from being a human. Humans are the kinds of things that get humor. Something from an extrinsic principle would be like light in the air that comes from the sun. It's not that the air itself has from its intrinsic principle light. It's that it comes from an extrinsic thing, right? It comes from the sun. So that's premise one. Premise two is the causal PSR, the causal principle of sufficient reason. And it goes like this. In either case, the properties a thing has require some form of explanation or reason in the form of a cause. Now, there are a number of objections to causality viewed in this way. This is, I would say, the natural view of causality. But there is throughout philosophy a lot of objections to this view, especially coming from Hume. That's one a lot of people's favorites. David Lewis is another one. We can talk about those, and I think it would be good to do it in other videos. But I would say that this view of causality is just the common sense one. It's the one that you naturally would think of. That, yeah, you don't just look at something and say, oh, it just has that property because it just has that property. You say, like, why does it have that property? It must have some kind of cause, right? So the causal PSR, at the very least, we can say it starts off very plausible. Now, the esse of a thing, the existence of a thing, can't be caused by its intrinsic nature. And why is that? Aquinas says, because then it would have to exist before it existed. You need to be able to exist in order to cause something. But if you're causing your own existence, then that means you have to exist first, then cause your existence, but you already existed, right? So that doesn't make sense. Therefore, the existence or the esse of a thing must come from an extrinsic principle. And of course, we're talking about things whose essence are not their esse. Remember, that's important. If your essence is your esse, then you don't ask what caused, you just say, oh, that's just what it is. Okay, then, for things whose existence is distinct from their esse, we have to ask this question, what caused them, right? What external principle gave them their existence? And this external principle either could be this pure esse, this self-subsistent esse, or it could be something else that has their essence and their esse distinct. Now, if it's that something else, then we have to ask the question, well, back to the causal PSR, what gave this thing its existence? Where did it get its esse? And then the question moves back one. Well, either the thing that gave it its esse is self-subsistent esse, or is another thing whose essence and esse are distinct. And we have to ask the question all over again. So either we go back to some primal essence is its esse, or we have this infinite chain of essence esses that are distinct, that are causing the esse of the thing next to it. And Aquinas says you can't have that infinite regress. And it's not for the reason you might think. It's not for the reason that the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, gives. Aquinas actually does think there can be an infinite, like he thinks that there can be an infinite past. He just thinks that on faith, he doesn't believe that there is an infinite past. But he doesn't believe here you can have an infinite chain. There's a lot that goes in here having to do with actual versus potential infinities, per accidents versus per se infinities. Just to sort of skip over all that, he's talking about a per se infinity where you have one thing depending on the other thing, depending on the other thing, all for their, this one thing esse. Well, if you have an infinite chain like that, and there's no first thing that introduces the esse into the chain, that introduces the existence into the chain, then all you have is just a bunch of potential things that exist, and they don't actually exist. Nothing comes into actual existence to give existence to anything else, because nothing actually has esse, nothing actually has existence. So he says, in this case, you can't have an infinite chain. And therefore, there must exist this thing that we're talking about, this self-subsistent esse, this thing whose essence is its existence. And again, to belabor the point, when we're talking about existence here, remember, it's not a property, it's an act. It's something that the thing is doing. Now, there are a few objections that get raised against this argument, against the very idea of a self-subsistent esse given by Anthony Kenny and Alvin Plantinga. I think what we might do, I could make another video just on that, or I could just put it in my website. So check my website. I'll go over the arguments there. Needless to say, I think that they are very answerable. I think that the argument actually works. But again, the reason I like this argument is not just because I think it's a solid argument, but because I think there are other things that it proves. So for example, it proves that God is radically simple. He has no parts whatsoever. Any kind of composition in God would show that God relies on those parts in order to exist. But as we saw in this argument, that would require a cause. And we just said this is self-subsistent esse. This is something that exists by the very nature of what it is, so it couldn't have parts. So it's radically simple. We've also seen that God must be immaterial in this argument, that there could be only one God. It also shows that God must be eternal, because change requires the actualization of potency, right? It requires you to have some potential and to have that potential be actualized. But this thing that is pure existence, that's pure act, right? There is no potency. So this thing must be eternal because it can't change. It also must be infinite because potential, potency, is what limits you. You could be this thing, but you're not. You're just potentially that thing. Well, this thing, this pure act, this pure existence would not have any potential, right? It would be pure actuality. And so it would be an unlimited thing, an unlimited existent. And that means anything that it has must be unlimited. So for example, if the thing is powerful, it must be unlimited in its power. And it must be powerful because it created stuff. So you have omnipotence. So all kinds of things that you can go. Obviously, this is a very, very cursory view of the way that you could argue using this argument. But hopefully you can see how powerful the argument is based on that cursory view. In any case, let me know if you have any questions on the argument. Let me know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and I will see you in the next video. Adios.